I have this standard size gaming PC that I'm wanting to downsize to something much smaller. Now, small enough to fit into a media center or to hide away behind a monitor for more desk space, and to be relatively portable to take to a friend's house. At least more portable than this 50-liter behemoth. So that's what we're gonna do today. Try to fit all of the important stuff from this mid-tower gaming PC into a case that is more than 70% smaller. This video is sponsored by Ugreen. So Ugreen recently sent over their new Nexode power bank with a 20,000 milliamp battery and a 130 watt output. And I've been really finding it pretty useful as a part of my everyday carry. Now, the whole package here is super light and compact. It has this column design that makes it easy to hold, and it also easily fits into my bag alongside all of my other devices that I use this thing to charge when I need to. So like I mentioned, it has a 20,000 milliamp battery, which meets the standards to bring on an airplane, but it also has enough capacity to charge my iPhone up to 4 times. And if I use the out 1 port, which has a 100 watt output, it can get me from 0 to 55% in only 30 minutes. But you're not limited to one device at a time. There are multiple ports here so that you can quickly charge multiple devices at the same time. And the really unique thing here is that it also has an LCD screen. This is where you can view all types of real-time info, like how much battery power is remaining, along with the charge time, voltage, and a bunch of other useful stats. There's also a smaller 12,000 milliamp version if you're wanting an even more compact power bank that still provides a 100 watt quick charge. So if you're interested in checking one of these out yourself, I'll leave a link in the description below. So let's start by taking a look at what we currently have. So this is the NZXT H6 Flow. Honestly, it's a beautiful case with a panoramic glass panel and a ton of airflow. We have 3 side intake fans and another at the rear, a 240mm AIO, your standard size ATX motherboard, an Intel i5-14600K, 32 gigs of RAM, and a 4080 Super. Then hidden away in the back, we have an ATX power supply. So this here, I think, represents a fairly typical gaming PC in 2024, at least in terms of like the average sizes of the core components that you would, typically expect in a custom PC or a pre-built. Now, if you're watching this and you're thinking of downsizing your PC, it's like 99% likely that you're not gonna have the same specs that I have here. But if you are coming from a mid-tower, you are likely to have a 2 to 3 slot GPU, an ATX power supply, an ATX motherboard, etc. Now, the idea here is to downsize without rebuying everything. But that doesn't mean anything because obviously that would be impossible. You have to at least buy the case. And in this one, you'll likely need to buy 3 things: the case, a riser cable, which can be purchased with the case, and then you'll very likely need a low profile CPU cooler. Now, depending on your CPU's cooling needs, you can pick one up from Amazon for under $40. So relative to what we're doing here, I don't think that's a terribly expensive addition. And I say very likely because depending on your configuration, you actually might not need it. Now, let me explain. So this is the SFF Time N ATX case. It's a 15-liter slim console style, or as they like to refer to it as, a pizza box style case. Now, this is primarily designed as a vertical case, but because all of the CPU and GPU fans point the same direction, you do have the option to set it horizontally with some inexpensive optional case fee. Now, the case materials here are very solid. The panels are made of a pretty thin powder coated aluminum with like 0 flex to them. The white coating on mine is very well done, so there's no scratches or blemishes in the finish. And yeah, I'm just super happy with the overall quality so far. Now, it does come flat packed, so there is some assembly required, but it's actually really straightforward. I think in total, it took me around 20 minutes to put it all together, and that was because I was filming it. So if I wasn't stopping to mess around with my cameras, then I would say it would have taken me around 10 minutes or less to put it all together. So yeah, not a lot of pieces here. So we just have the top and rear panels, which are fixed together with a couple of screws. Then the motherboard tray, which attaches to those panels. And from there, we can fix the bottom panel and the front panel. Now, for the most part, every one of these steps use the same black countersunk screws, so it's not too confusing from that standpoint, but there is a separate set of screws for the standoffs and the motherboard. Now, once all of those pieces are together, we can put in our front panel USB-C and the faceplate. Now, the last thing we need to do here before we can start moving all of our parts over is to install the motherboard standoffs. Now, SFF Time does include a hex tool in the box so that it's pretty easy to tighten these all the way. And now that the case is all put together, we can actually start moving everything over. So I'm going to disconnect everything from the motherboard. So that's all of the case IO, the fans, the power connectors, and the CPU cooler. Then I'm going to unscrew it and then remove the motherboard. Now, of course, we are not going to be able to bring absolutely everything from this 50-liter case over to this one, but let's take a look at what we can. So this case supports basically everything from a mini ITX up to a full-sized ATX motherboard. And if you're someone who's building, in this case, with an ITX board, that does open you up to more CPU cooling options. And this is what I was referring to earlier when I was talking about you may or may not need that low profile CPU. So if you do happen to be building in this with an ITX board, you have the option to fit up to a 360mm AIO with a single slot GPU along the bottom. Or if you swap out the fans for slim ones, you can squeeze a 2-slot card. But for this video, if you're downsizing from a mid-tower or something similar, then you are far more likely to have an ATX board, which does limit you to either a 120mm AIO with a shorter GPU or an air cooler up to 79mm in height. And that's what we're gonna go with in this build. Now, in this video, I actually did install the air cooler last, but I would highly recommend that you install it before your motherboard, because even though there is a cutout for the backplate, they don't really seem to have cut it low enough to clear any backplate. And an example, if I want to install the ID Cooling 67XT, I would not be able to do so at this point, at least for an Intel board. So the cooler here I'm using is the Noctua NH-L12S. It's a low profile 70mm CPU cooler. This is one that I've used several times in the past, and honestly one of the best options at this size in my opinion. Although they did recently launch the 77mm version, so that should be a little bit more effective. I wasn't actually able to get my hands on one in time for this video, but if you are able to get that, it may perform a little bit better. Now, next up is the GPU. So this case can support up to a 4-slot GPU if you're using an ITX board. But with an ATX board, we do get a little bit less space because, it's using some of it. So 3¼ slots is what we can fit, and 380mm in length is the max length here, which should be plenty of room for the majority of GPUs. Now the one I'm gonna be using here is 3 slots. So we can adjust for the distance we want the GPU to sit from the side panel on the riser bracket. So I'm gonna set mine to the 3-slot position and then secure the riser bracket to the bottom of the case. Then we can get the riser cable, plug that into the PCI Express slot on the motherboard, and then secure the other end of it to the riser bracket. All right, so now on the GPU itself, we can secure this GPU bracket to the IO shield with 2 screws and then slot the GPU into the riser cable and then secure it to the case. All right, the last thing we need to move over is the power supply. Now there's plenty of room in here for an ATX power supply up to 180mm in length. This is going to cover a majority of the popular ATX power supplies. Now, as an example, the NZXT C1200, which is a 1200 watt power supply, is 150mm in length. The Corsair RM1000X power supplies are 180mm. And the one I'm using here is the RM750E, which is a shorter supply at 140mm, which of course, the shorter the power supply, the more room you're gonna have for cable management. So let's grab the power supply bracket and attach it to the unit with 4 screws. Then we can plug in the angled power cable and make sure that the power supply is switched on because you're not really going to be able to reach it easily once it's secured into the case. And also you want to make sure that the power extension is already routed through the hole in the rear panel. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do that once you, again, secure it to the case. Now with the extra room at the bottom right here, you can actually install a few 2.5-inch drives if you are carrying some over. Now, depending on your configuration, I believe you can fit up to 11 drives in this case. So yeah, a shitload of storage if you need it. Now, SFF Time has a very comprehensive guide on their website where you can get more specifics on those locations and the dimensions for all of the components really. So I'll actually link that in the description. But for me, I'm going to be using that space for a 120mm fan. So I'm gonna install that and then plug in our power connectors, the case IO, and of course that fan we just installed. Now, last thing to do here is to secure the side panels, and that's the build complete. Now there's also a vertical stand included. I don't really love how it's held together because it's held together with the side panels and it's kind of a pain to deal with. I would have much preferred a way to actually just screw it into the bottom panel, but you're probably gonna wanna use that considering the power button is hidden on the bottom. All right, so what's the difference between the thermals and the noise levels between the two builds? So surprising absolutely nobody, the 240mm AIO is going to give you much better cooling performance than the low profile CPU cooler here. I was seeing anywhere between the mid 40s to the low 50s on the CPU and mid 60s for the GPU when I was benchmarking in Furmark, and similar readings when I was running a 4K gaming benchmark with Black Myth Wukong. Now in the new smaller case, Temperatures raised to the mid to high 60s and low 70s for the CPU, and the GPU temps were largely the same, still in the mid 60s running the same tests. Now, the higher CPU temps are not surprising at all considering what we just moved from, but with that said, these are not bad temps. They're actually perfectly fine. And if I'm being honest, it's a little bit better than I was expecting. Still, I mean, there's a 10+ degree difference between the two, but I mean, come on. The case is 70% smaller. And given the specs here, this makes the most sense paired with a 4K workload. So that's what I'm working with. But of course, this is all going to heavily depend on what CPU you have and how your existing cooling solution compares to the low profile one that I have here. But at least you can get a vague idea of what you could expect. Now, I would highly recommend that if you are considering doing this, go to the CPU compatibility checker on Noctua's website and see if a low profile CPU cooler like the one I'm using here will be sufficient for your CPU. And I'll link that in the description. Okay, as far as noise levels go, this is a pretty tough one to pick up on the microphone. And that's because I usually have to boost the gain in order for you to hear it. And that might slightly misrepresent what I'm actually hearing in real life. Still, I'm gonna include that in this video, but I do wanna say first that in real life, the difference was honestly negligible. And interestingly, my decibel meter was actually picking up the NZXT H6 as being louder than the new one. And that's probably because there's more fans, but with some tuning, of course, you could probably get those quieter if you need to. I didn't actually feel the need to because I don't think that they were loud to begin with. I was using a standard fan profile that comes with the NZXT cam software. Now, moving over to the smaller case, yeah, I do think that it is louder, but it's so hard to tell. And obviously, I was doing this, for this video, so I was intentionally, listening for it. And for what it's worth, neither of them were louder than my AC running in the room, which does make it a little bit more difficult to tell the difference. I actually had to turn off the AC just to run the tests. So yeah, take that for what it's worth. Now, if you're new to the small form factor PC space, you may be seeing this as an example that, all CPU cooling in small PCs is bad. That's simply just not true. You can build in smaller cases than this and fit a 3-slot GPU and a 240mm radiator if you need, more CPU cooling, with a big GPU. Look at the T1, look at the Dan A4H2O, along with a bunch of other examples that I could point to. This is a more unique situation. We are trying to fit a ATX motherboard along with, all of this. It's gonna be up to you to decide if the trade-off of higher CPU temps and a potentially higher noise level is worth it for the smaller size. Now, I personally am biased towards the smaller size myself. Of course, I find that the smaller size to be far more convenient when it comes to desk space and using it as a living room console and a bunch of other use cases. And I personally don't find that the noise level difference to be, noticeable or distracting. And yes, the CPU might run hotter, but it's not to the point where it's not properly cooled. Now, I have done this downsizing thing before with the Meshroom S. In that video, I was able to bring over an ATX board along with a 3080 and a 240mm AIO. Now, if you're interested in seeing that version, I'll put a link up on the screen. So I hope this video helped you in some way. Thank you so much for watching.